Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 5 of Mind the Music, the podcast where I talk about usually random things to do with my music, but I attempt to make it interesting. Today, I'm going to be talking about why collaborations are usually a struggle and what is the best way you can overcome these struggles and whether it's even worth doing so. First of all, I want to apologise for not uploading that many episodes of Mind the Music recently. It's been quite a while since the last episode, I think. And the reason for that is because I've been very busy with uni work. We've had 2 new modules that we have to do, and they're both very intensive. It's very strange doing them from home, but it's very important that I get them done. And I've also been working on my 3rd year project. As a computer science student, I have to do a lot of programming, and it's quite difficult. It's a lot of tedious work. There's a little bit of writing involved as well, but it's quite intensive. In general, like recently, there's been a lot of intensive uni work. I've also been working on a lot of collaborations. So I've recently done a track called Rest, which featured IPJS, I think that's his name, and a guy called Decker with Avalanche, which was really good. I've also got 2 tracks coming up and possibly a 3rd, which is not a collaboration. But those collaborations are the main reason why I'm making this episode today, because I've talked about collaborations before in episode 2 of Mind the Music, which I will leave a link to, which is basically where I talked about what a collaboration actually is, how they help people's exposure, and basically just went over like rating some of my collaborations, but I didn't really talk about how they were made. I just kind of talked about how good they were. This episode is more of a focus on how collaborations are actually produced, how I go about my collaboration projects, and the reason why they are such a struggle, because they're actually very, very difficult to organize and manage if you do them poorly. So obviously, first thing you want to do is, when it comes to making a collaboration, is you actually want to initialize the project by talking to somebody. You actually want to message whoever it is you're collaborating with, or whoever you want to collaborate with. And it might be a situation where they message you, which is amazing. It's very exciting when somebody else on some platform messages you saying, hey, I really like your music, I want to collaborate with you, let's do something. And that's happened to me several times. It happened to me with a couple of people, one guy on Twitter and a couple of other people from Submit Hub, which is very exciting. And most of the time you want to be the one to collaborate with somebody else if you really like their stuff. That was the case with me and Black Winter. I basically met him ages ago on a Discord server. I heard some of his stuff. I think it was the Superwearer community, which is not really a community I'm a part of anymore. I occasionally post my stuff. I won't go too far into detail into that because that's kind of, diverting away from the topic. But basically, I met Black Winter in that server. I listened to some of his stuff. I think it was one of his tracks called Riot, if I remember rightly. And I really, really liked his style. It was so good, I thought to myself, I've got to collaborate with this guy. Our styles are so similar, and his mixing and his mastering, they were both just on point. I wanted to work with him. And to this day, we've done a lot of stuff together. So it was a good idea for me to basically branch out to him and say, shall we do something? And that was basically how Crisis came about. And then obviously we worked on some other stuff. We've worked on some other stuff recently, which again, I will go over at the end. But of course, when it comes to initializing a project, when it comes to just messaging somebody, even that can have its problems, because often is the case where people will take a really, really long time to respond, and they might not always say yes to your offer either. Sometimes people can take days to respond, and obviously it can be annoying because they have their own things to do. They're probably busy doing their own things. But it's frustrating because when you're working on a project yourself, the only person you have to rely on is you, right? You choose when you want to do things, you choose when you want to get stuff done, and you don't have to wait for anybody else. But of course, when it comes to a collaboration, when it comes to working with other people, all of a sudden now, when you've done your part and suddenly you have to give your part to them for them to do, and there's nothing more you can do, you have to wait for them to finish their part. If it was just you on your own, you could carry on, but you have to wait for them to do their bit, which can take any amount of time. It can be quite frustrating because it might be that you wait a couple hours if you're lucky, but usually it's the case where you have to wait a couple days. And in my case, I've had to wait up to a week for people to complete a small chunk of the project because they might be busy, or they say they're busy, but they might not actually be doing anything. And as I said, they might not always say yes to wanting to do a collaboration because your styles might clash too much, or because they don't have the time, or purely because they just don't want to work with you. And that's absolutely fine. If they don't want to work with you, you mustn't pressure them. You might as well just move on. And yeah, that can be, quite frustrating. Even like the initialization stage of a collaboration can be annoying, especially if they don't want to do it with you. But eventually you'll find somebody that wants to collaborate with you, someone that wants to produce a project with you, and that can be very exciting. I know the feeling of, finally like working on a new idea, because it takes a lot of pressure off of you. When other people come up with ideas, you don't have to worry about doing every single thing in the project. You don't have to worry about making the chord progression. You don't have to worry about the melodies, the leads, the drums. You don't have to worry about everything. They can have their part and you can have your part. Sometimes they'll start with an idea, which is great, because that's kind of what happened with Avalanche. I initialized the collaboration with Decca after hearing his project Chaos Theory, which was the only thing he had on Spotify at the time. And I really liked his style, and I feel like it might be a good idea if I try and make something with him. You never know. It could be someone that just never responded, but of course he did. And he came up with a very good idea of organising a project, which I'm going to go into later. And also we used two completely different recording studios. We used two completely different DAWs, digital audio workstations. I used Mixcraft 9 and he used FL Studio, like the majority of people that make dance music, essentially. Again, we'll get into that very, very soon. So Decca was the one that came up with the initial chord progression, the initial idea that involved the chords, and that was basically where it started. Just a few chords, just a little, interesting mess around. Then I basically made the lead and came up with some basic sound design, which he liked, and then we just kind of worked from there. We started off with the breakdown this time, which is funny because that's not something I normally do. Usually I start with the drop, and if I have a good drop, I know the track is going to progress well, so I kind of build around the drop. But we actually started with the breakdown. We made sure that the chords at the very beginning were as good as they could be, and that's probably why the actual chord progression in Avalanche sounds that way. Why it sounds good, because we made sure it sounded good from the very beginning. Now, the best practice when it comes to initializing a collaboration, right? The best practice when it comes to software is making sure that you use the same software. If you use FL Studio and somebody else uses FL Studio, that's great, because you can share project files. Because obviously FL Studio and other DAWs like Mixcraft and Logic Pro, they all have their own file formats, right? Mixcraft 9 has a .mx9 format. I can't remember what FL Studio's one. I think it's .flp, and then Logic Pro has I can't actually remember what it is, like .logx or something like that. That's for like Logic Pro 10. It doesn't matter. The point is, different softwares, different DAWs will have their own file formats, and of course, if I try and open a FL Studio project in Mixcraft 9, it won't work because the file formats just clash. It doesn't make any sense. So it makes the most sense to collaborate with people that use the same software as you. But for somebody like me who has Mixcraft 9 and nobody else in the world has Mixcraft 9, it's a lot more difficult because we can't share project files. However, we can share stems, which is basically where you export every single track as an audio file, with or without effects. And you kind of zip that up and you give it to people and they can just kind of put that in their project. And that's great because that is independent of whatever software you're using. It doesn't matter if you're using FL or Mixcraft 9 or Logic Pro 10 or Ableton. Stems will work for everyone because it's literally just audio files. As long as your software can support audio files, then you will be able to use other people's stems. Sometimes stems can be exported in a bit of a weird way, but it doesn't really matter that much. Usually when it comes to collaborations, most people will just use stems. And yeah, as I said, stems are normally transferred as an audio file, but they're normally transferred because there's a lot of information in stems. Stems can normally be quite big depending on the track. They can normally be like a few gigabytes. It's almost as if you're transferring a sample pack of sounds that you download from the internet, like a Kashmir sample pack or a Headhunters sample pack or a Stick sample pack or anything like that. They can be pretty big files, so of course they need to be zipped up and you need to figure out a way of transferring them back and forth. Normally when it comes to transferring files, if I have enough space, I'll use Dropbox. There's also WeTransfer, which is a good one because you can upload some pretty big files there and they're very clean, with how they work. There are other ways. If the files are small enough, if you just need to transfer a few MP3s that are less than 8 megabytes, then you can transfer them over Discord. I think Skype has the slightly bigger file limit, and there's also Teams if you want to use Teams, but I don't know how many people collaborate over Teams, but the option is there. But this leads to a bit of a problem when it comes to using stems. Using stems in this way can sometimes create inconsistencies where the actual sounds that you're using become out of date, which is a problem. Imagine that you've started a project with somebody. You've got a number of tracks, say 8 or 9 audio tracks with some piano, some drums, some bass, some synths, and you export it as stems. So each of those 8 or 9 tracks are exported as an audio file. You then zip them up and you give them to whoever you're working with. They unzip them, they put them in their project, and they carry on working. But now we have a bit of a problem because the stems that you have are not the same as the stems they have. They now have an updated version of the stems that you sent, which is fine. It means that the project can progress, but you also need to be able to hear those stems. You need those stems that they now have, so you can continue your part of the project. But that can't happen until they finish their part and send you them back. But sometimes, that can create problems. They might not send all of them back. They might send them back with problems. They might not. They might forget to export something properly. They might not even name the stems properly. And that's something that you're both responsible for when exporting stems. You need to make sure your stems are exported with the correct file names, so it's clear what the track is and when it was made. So if you need to update it, you can clearly see which version of your stems is up to date. And this is an even bigger problem when the project is bigger and it's constantly changing, right? If the project is something that you're going back and forth on a lot, which is usually the case if you're both working on it quite frequently, then the stems can become a lot more inconsistent. And this is obviously a big problem. As I've said, you need to make sure that whatever stems you've got are the up-to-date version. This was the case when I was working on a recent collaboration with Black Minter. I won't say the name because it hasn't been released yet and we haven't decided on quite a lot of stuff about it. I was working on it, I practically finished it, I gave the stems to him, but now he's worked on it a little bit and he's added his own files, his own additional stems, which he hasn't sent to me. So what this means is I now have an older version of the project which doesn't match what he has, and basically anything that he does to the project, it has to be him that does it to the project, not me, because I have an older version of the project. Unless he sends me the new updated stems, then, that's fine. But often that is the case where he won't need to do that if the track is almost finished, So, that's fine. Usually one way you can solve this is by using a cloud-based service like Google Drive. And actually, this is one of the best ways to share stuff. There's also a problem with how you actually export your stems. Should you export each track separately, or should you create a single bus with all, for example, all drum parts, all bass parts, all synth parts? This is kind of a tricky thing to do, because if you export everything together, for example, if you export the drum bus as one part, it means you can't mix each individual component by itself. If you export each track separately, for example, the kick, the snare, the hi-hats, the ride, the cymbals, you'll be able to mix each of them individually, but it does mean that you'll have more tracks to deal with, and it can lead to a higher risk of having an inconsistent project, a project that is, far more likely to be out of date. But that can be okay, if you can handle that, if you can manage that sort of thing, that can be fine. Also, if you have software that can actually manage that increase in tracks, you should be fine. But as I said, you have the option to also create a bus full of your specific parts. So imagine taking all of your individual drum parts, the kick, snare, hi-hat, rides, and just compressing them down into one track, which is often referred to as the drum bus, because it's got all the drum parts on it. As long as you don't need to mix any more of the drum parts, exporting the drums into a single bus is normally not a bad step. This was the case with Avalanche. Decker did the drums. He mixed all of the drum parts and basically compressed them into a single drum bus, which had all of the drum parts. And this worked okay. I didn't have to mix any of them individually. I was able to just have them in the project with all of my other components, and it worked quite well. So, as I said previously, probably one of the best practices when it comes to organizing a collaboration is to use some kind of shared folder or cloud service like Google Drive or a shared Dropbox folder, right? The reason why is because it's just a lot easier to keep stuff up to date with cloud services when you need multiple people accessing the same thing. This is the whole point of cloud services and why they're extremely useful. I highly recommend Google Drive. The majority of people have Google Drive, and what you want to do is when you're making a collaboration, you want to set up a Google Drive, a shared Google Drive folder with a number of different subfolders that have things like MIDI files, audio files, leads, chords. It depends on what your project is. So if it's a more acoustic project, you could have some folders for guitar, bass, drums, vocals, so you can more easily separate stuff. And of course, within those folders, you want to make sure that your tracks are named correctly. So the track name is accurate. Obviously, that's the first step. And also make sure that your tracks have dates on them. They don't need to have times, but as long as they have a date, so you know when stuff was obviously added, it can keep stuff organized much more easily. You can also sort things in these folders via time, which makes it a lot easier to see when stuff was added. So I highly recommend doing this when organizing a project. There are some cloud-based DAWs. I can't name any of them at this stage, but they're not really that good in terms of performance because they can only perform as well as a browser. So for example, if you've got Google Chrome and you try using one of these DAWs, there's only so much it can do. It can only perform so well as the code that it is written in, if that makes sense. It doesn't use any additional applications, any additional programs. This is the reason why, for example, Discord works a lot better as the application than in the browser, because the actual code is different. It's written differently, so it has different capabilities. So making sure that you use an actual DAW, usually on your laptop, not on your phone, is what you need to do. Don't bother trying to use a cloud-based DAW, because that does solve the problem of organization. It does solve the problem of consistency, but it will have a huge impact on what you can actually do with the project, which is far more important than how the project is organized. There's no doubt that organizing a project well is important for making sure you get stuff done on time, for making sure that stuff is consistent, and it means that the project can flow more naturally. But that's not as important as the project itself. And even if it's a case where two of you have different softwares that you use, again, for example, Mixcraft 9 versus FL Studio, having a shared Dropbox or Google Drive folder is enough to keep the project organized with stems. Then of course, as I mentioned previously, when you do your part and you need them to do a new part, you have to wait for them to respond again, which can be very, very frustrating. Again, as I said, if you're working alone, you only have to worry about your own schedule, but when you're working with other people, you have to wait for them to finish their part, which can take an arbitrary amount of time. Sometimes they'll kind of reassure you, they say, I've got a little bit to do right now, but don't worry, I'll have this done with you soon. Even that is still quite arbitrary. It's just a little bit of false reassurance to say, please don't get annoyed at me, because I promise I am working on it, but it will take a little bit of time. That doesn't mean anything because you're still not actually working on the project. And of course, you don't want to be rude. You don't want to have to ask them to work faster. That's what you're screaming in your mind. You're saying, please hurry up with this. I want to get this done so I can get the exposure as quickly as possible. But of course, nobody wants to say that because that's kind of rude. So, you know, I wouldn't worry about that too much. They will get back to you eventually if they are dedicated with this project. Although having said that, I have had people message me about collaborations. I have given them some project files and they've just never ever gotten back to me. So be careful who you get back to. Make sure that if somebody wants to collaborate with you, make sure that you're checking out their previous work. Make sure that you're hearing some of their stuff so you get a better idea. Don't just jump into a project with someone just because they've asked you to. If somebody that you don't know messages you saying, hey, do you want to do a collaboration? Don't just immediately get excited and say, yeah, sure, let's go. You need to take a look at some of their previous work. You need to take a listen to their background information, their work, so you get a better idea of what they sound like, what they do, and whether it's actually worth collaborating with them in the first place. If you know that they are trustworthy, if you know that they can, if you can work with them, if they seem like they've got a good track record with their tracks and their responses, then go for it. See what happens. See if you can work with them. If they start to take a little too long to respond, just give them a little bit of a friendly nudge saying, how's the project coming along? That's a much friendlier way of saying, please hurry up with the project. I don't know why you're taking so long. Just ask them politely. Say, hey, how's it going with the project? Have you worked on the project recently? It doesn't sound as nagging. It doesn't sound as buggy. So that's definitely a more polite way to go about it. So Collaborations are extremely fun to do. There's absolutely no doubt that working with other people is fun. But as I've said, it can be very cumbersome if you don't know how to approach it. It's definitely a lot more work, and it's definitely a lot harder than making a project on your own, because when you're working on your own, the only person you have to rely on is yourself. You only have to rely on the sounds that you've got, the plugins and the other bits and pieces that you've got available to you. The person that you're collaborating with might be able to use that, which could be advantageous to them. And of course, one of the best things about collaboration is being able to mishmash each other's sounds, being able to combine both of your sounds, which is, one of my favorite parts about a collaboration. It's being able to combine two people's idea of what a good sound is and creating something new, which is why if you listen to all of my collaborations, they all sound slightly different, but part of each collaboration I've done, you can clearly tell that I have been involved in it. You can clearly tell that some of those sounds involve me, because I'd like to believe I have some distinction in my music. For example, if you listen to Ataraxy, which was a collaboration I did with a lad called YesJ, you can tell that the style is a little bit different, right? You can tell that the production is a bit different because there's a lot more compression than I would normally use. The audio quality is a bit different. The structuring is a bit different. It's a lot more lively. It's a lot happier. That's not something that I normally do. That's not something I normally, delve into. But you can tell that the difference is there. You can also tell that my sounds are there as well, like the vocal chops, the synths. There is definitely some stuff there that I have used, and that is quite evident. Again, when working with someone like Black Winter, the tracks are normally more aggressive, normally a lot sharper, more bassier. They're mixed a bit different, and you can tell there's a bit of a difference there. With Decca, again, the kick was a lot punchier. There was a lot more interesting growls that I wouldn't usually use. The actual drop, the way the drop was structured was similar, and had a lot of my stuff in it as well. But the bass was different, the kick was different. The actual lead synth, the way it was compressed, the way it was designed was a bit different. So those differences are definitely there when it comes to collaborating with somebody else using their own sounds. And it's very exciting to be able to use somebody else's sounds, to be able to, share ideas and perhaps even use their sounds for your projects in the future. It's definitely worth collaborating with people, especially if you're looking to get more exposure, because as I've said in the previous Mind the Music podcast, episode 2, that's not the previous podcast, but as I've said in a previous podcast, which happens to be Mind the Music episode 2, collaborations are a good way to increase exposure for both of you, especially if you're both relatively big artists. So it's something that I recommend everybody does at least once, at least try to collaborate with somebody, because you never know, you might end up going down a really interesting path that you couldn't have foreseen. There's a lot of people that I've worked with that I still keep in touch with every day, believe it or not. And there's people that, they constantly check out my social media. They're constantly supporting me. So these people that you meet with collaborations, they can help you, and you get the chance to help them as well, which again is very interesting, and it's incredibly important when it comes to developing as a producer or just as a musician in general. If you're someone that just does vocals for people, you can appear in a lot of people's tracks, and suddenly if you're in the same place, people will start to notice you. Hey, this person's been in loads of different people's tracks on this platform. Maybe I should work with them. Maybe I could help them out with something, with some cover art, or maybe even they would work with me and I'd actually pay them, and suddenly you start to make money with the people that want to collaborate with you, which is very exciting. But yeah, that's basically going to do it for this episode. I've definitely waffled on a bit too much, but as I've said, when it comes to collaborations, there's a lot to talk about, and it's incredibly important that you organize your projects and don't be intimidated by what needs to be done. As long as you know what you're doing, as long as you're both communicating with each other, and you're both aware exactly what each other has done with the project, because communication is easily the most important thing when it comes to a collaboration, when it comes to working with anybody. As long as you're both communicating efficiently, and as long as everything is well organized, your collaborations will turn out amazing, and people are really going to enjoy them, and it's a lot of fun to do. So that's going to wrap it up for this episode. As I said, I've been working on a lot of interesting stuff recently. So obviously I've done 2 collaborations. One is Rest with IPJS. I'll recommend checking that out. I'll leave a link to that in the description. Another one is Avalanche by me and Decca. I'll leave that in the description. I'll also leave a link in the description to my playlist, which has all of my collaborations in it if you're interested in checking it out. I've got 2 collaborations coming in the future. They are both with Black Winter, but the release dates have not been decided yet, and they're both very, very good tracks. And hopefully, once that's done, hopefully very soon, I've got another track which is not a collaboration, but it is a solo track, which is basically it's a remastered version of an older track, which I'm very, very much looking forward to. I'm pretty sure I've hinted at it in a few places, and some of you have probably already picked up what it is. But as I said, it's going to be really good. It's so much better than what it was originally, and I'm really looking forward to it. I'm really looking forward to sharing it on the channel with you guys. So that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time. Bye.